Mario!
Let's kick things off with the greatest launch title of all time, Super Mario 64. Now that might be a bold statement to some, but I can't think of any other game that is more deserving of that title than Super Mario 64. Believe it or not, Super Mario 64 began development right after Star Fox wrapped. Shigeru Miyamoto was interested in using the 3D graphics granted by the Super Effects chip to create a 3D Mario game. However, it became very clear very quickly that what Miyamoto had in mind wasn't going to be possible on the Super Nintendo. That was okay though, because Nintendo had started work on their NES console, and being such a prominent figure in the company, Miyamoto had a clear idea of what the N64 was going to be like from the get-go. So Miyamoto got to work, but it was slow going. A 3D platformer like this had never been attempted, so there were a lot of questions that no one had any answers to. They actually spent a whole year in pre-production before they moved to full production, which was unheard of in those days. Even today, that's not something you hear about too often. The next 2 years would be spent on development, and during that time, Nintendo had come to the conclusion that they had royally fucked up by pissing off Sony. The PlayStation was already out and was taking the gaming industry by storm. Nintendo was concerned that their launch lineup wasn't going to be up to snuff, especially since most of their favorite third-party developers had jumped ship. To make matters worse, it wasn't looking like the new Mario game was going to be finished in time for the launch of the console. So Nintendo made a bold move. They halted production on all games that they had in production, regardless of how close they were to completion, and reallocated all resources to Super Mario 64. This would mean that Super Mario 64 would be one of only 2 launch titles for the N64, something that many would deem unacceptable today. However, Nintendo believed that quality would be better than quantity in this case, and they were right on the money because upon its release, Super Mario 64 would be deemed a groundbreaking masterpiece, ensuring a strong start for Nintendo's new console. In Super Mario 64, Mario is called to the castle of Princess Peach, who has baked a cake for her favorite hero to enjoy. Upon his arrival, however, Mario realizes that something is afoot. It appears Bowser is up to his old tricks again and has laid siege to the castle. He's imprisoned Peach and has cast a spell over the castle that turns all the paintings into portals to whole other worlds. Within these worlds, Bowser is in the Power Stars, which power the castle's defense systems. So now Mario must enter the worlds in order to gather the Power Stars, free the castle from Bowser's grip, and save the princess. Though it is basically the same plot the Mario series has always had, there's a little more detail here. But as for Miyamoto's design philosophy, it was done in service of the gameplay. As I said, there was a lot they needed to figure out in regards to Super Mario 64's design. For starters, as soon as 3D graphics were introduced, developers instantly became fascinated with crafting big, open worlds to explore. But there was a limit to how far they could take that. Keep in mind, the N64 wasn't exactly capable of something along the lines of GTA 3, and there were concerns about how that kind of world design would work. What kind of objectives would there be? How would you lead the player through the world? Would it be linear? Non-linear? So many questions, and the answers couldn't be looked up in a book because this was the first time any of those questions had even been asked. Miyamoto would eventually find a nice balance. Instead of one big open world, he instead crafted a series of smaller open worlds. The levels would be designed with a clear path forward, but there would be a variety of tasks to complete within the world, so you'd have a sense of linearity, but also enough room to explore. All of which is connected by a hub world, in this case, Princess Peach's castle. It was a solid structure, and the story they came up with to contextualize all of it works without adding anything more than is necessary. That brilliant design is supported by some great graphics as well. One of the things that Nintendo hoped would give them an edge over the PlayStation and Saturn was the fact that it was a 64-bit console as opposed to a 32-bit console, and that shows here. The graphics are bright, colorful, wonderfully varied, and have just the right amount of detail. The character models and animations are great, and it all runs at a silky smooth frame rate too. Really, going back to the game, the only thing that stands out to me as poorly rendered are the pre-rendered assets, which stick out like a sore thumb, and Bowser, who looks like he's having an allergic reaction. That aside though, the game is still appealing to look at, and I can't think of any game on either the PlayStation or Saturn that compares to this. Let's also not forget that wonderful soundtrack, composed of course by the great Koji Kondo. Yeah.
Let's go!
But the main reason Super Mario 64 did as well as it did was due to its gameplay. Super Mario 64 was the first of what we now refer to as a 3D collectathon platformer, where progression is based on collecting a very specific item, in this case, Power Stars. Peach's castle serves as a sort of hub world, and you enter the individual levels via the various paintings you'll find within it. Each level has 7 Power Stars to collect, and what's neat about this setup is that the game doesn't ask you to collect all the Power Stars to complete the game. In total, you only need 70 of the 120 stars that the game has, and that gives you a tremendous amount of choice as you are playing. For example, initially you only have access to 4 levels, but you only need 8 Power Stars to reach the final boss. You could get most of the stars you need from the very first level, or you can spread your efforts out across all of the available levels. This is something that is consistent throughout most of the game, so if there is a particular Power Star you are having a hard time obtaining, you can leave it and come back to it later, not to mention the fact that there are secret stars hidden throughout the castle to be on the lookout for. It's honestly surprising how much of the experience is left up to the player here. This level of freedom carries over into Mario's control as well. All they really need to do was polish running and jumping, and that still would have made for a fun game if the level design was good. But they did so much more here. Mario actually has a pretty complex moveset that allows him to traverse the levels in a variety of ways. If you push the jump button again just as you land, you'll make Mario jump even higher. If you repeat this a third time, he'll gain max height. If you pull back on the stick and jump, you'll get the same height as a triple jump. If you crouch and jump, you'll go even higher. If you run, crouch, and jump at the same time, you'll get a jump that covers a great distance. Press B and it'll send Mario diving forward, and if the angle is right, you can bounce off a wall to gain even more height. All this is easy to understand and difficult to master, and if you really know what you are doing, you can bypass a good deal of the game's level design. Seriously, the things speedrunners are able to do with this game is amazing, and people are always coming up with creative new ways to challenge this game. The most famous being the Green Demon Challenge.
Mamma mia!
I'm probably making Super Mario 64 out to be some kind of masterpiece, but there are some annoyances. For starters, while the control here is complex and fluid, it does feel a little stiff compared to newer games, especially when you go to perform the more advanced moves. The camera can be a little uncooperative as well, though you do have to cut some slack as this was the first game to feature an adjustable camera, but it's still annoying when you can't get the angle you need to see what you are doing. The pacing is a little sloppy too, as you are booted out of the level whenever you collect a Power Star, meaning you often have to cover a lot of the same ground whenever you re-enter a level. And as iconic as they are, the boss fights with Bowser are a little weak. Regardless of the issues it had, Nintendo's gamble to go all in on Super Mario 64 proved to pay off, as the game would go on to become one of the most critically acclaimed games of the generation. It was seen as a revolution in game design, and was said to be well ahead of any game that was coming out on the PlayStation. It also proved to be a financial success. Nintendo reported a near 1-to-1 sales ratio of consoles to games sold, which indicates that people bought the N64 just to play Super Mario 64. In fact, Super Mario 64 would go on to become the single best-selling game on the console. To make a long story short, Nintendo hit it out of the park with their first game on the console. The legacy of Super Mario 64 would endure, as it remained one of Nintendo's most frequently re-released games. The first re-release was Super Mario 64 DS, which sported updated graphics, extra content, and 3 new playable characters. Though all the added bells and whistles are nice, having to play Super Mario 64 on the D-pad with a run button isn't as satisfying, and thus I call it the lesser version. This is probably why Nintendo seems to prefer re-releasing the original game, which has been available digitally ever since that option has been available. Even today, Super Mario 64 is available as part of the Switch's online service. The game has seen a remaster in the form of Super Mario 3D All-Stars, which is the best way to play Super Mario 64. It is also the most expensive way to play the game, as 3D All-Stars only saw a limited print run. As a result, copies are already starting to get really pricey. I'm glad I bought my copy when it was still only $60. Regardless of how you play it though, Super Mario 64 still remains one of the most beloved games of all time, and is a must-play for all those who are a fan of game design.
Here we go!